The first time I realized my life was a staged production, I was standing in the middle of our kitchen, staring at a pot of boiling water that I didn't remember putting on the stove. It sounds like a small thing, the kind of domestic oversight that happens when you're tired or distracted, but for me, it was the fourth glitch in as many days. My husband, Mark, was sitting at the breakfast nook, his eyes never leaving his tablet as he reached out to pat my hand. He told me I was just stressed again, that the promotion at the gallery was taking its toll, and that I should probably go lie down. But I wasn't tired. I was terrified. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in your bones when you start to doubt your own senses, a feeling that the floor beneath you isn't quite solid. For months, things had been disappearing and reappearing in places they shouldn't be. My car keys would be in the refrigerator. My wedding ring would show up in the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn in years. And every time I questioned it, Mark would give me that look, the one filled with such profound, performative pity that it made me want to scream. It was the look of a man burdened by a wife who was slowly unraveling. That evening, Elena came over. Elena has been my best friend since we were 6 years old. She's the person who knows where all my metaphorical bodies are buried, or so I thought. She sat on the sofa, clutching a glass of wine, her face a mask of deep concern, as Mark confided in her about my latest lapse with the stove. I watched them from the doorway, and for a split second, I saw something that wasn't meant for me. It was a glance, a micro-expression shared between them, a subtle narrowing of the eyes, a silent communication that spoke of shared secrets and a common goal. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was enough to ignite a spark of cold clarity in my chest. I didn't say anything. I walked into the room, apologized for being scatterbrained, and watched how they both relaxed into their roles as my protectors. Elena suggested I see a specialist she knew, a Dr. Eris, who dealt specifically with early-onset cognitive issues. The way she said it with such gentle, faux maternal care made my skin crawl. They were building a narrative, a paper trail of my decline, and I was the only one who didn't have the script. The house felt different that night. It's a beautiful place, all glass walls and open spaces, designed to let the light in, but as the rain lashed against the windows, it felt like a cage. I lay in bed next to Mark, listening to his rhythmic breathing, pretending to be asleep, while my mind raced. I started mentally cataloging everything that had gone wrong lately. It wasn't just the keys or the stove. It was the way the digital clock in our room would be set 10 minutes fast some mornings, making me panic and rush, only for Mark to tell me I was imagining the time jump. It was the way my emails would be marked as read before I opened them. It was the way Mark started managing our joint accounts because I was struggling with the numbers. I realized then that I couldn't trust anything in this house, not the air, not the water, and certainly not the man sleeping beside me. I needed to know if I was actually sick or if I was being hunted in my own home. I decided right then that I would stop arguing. I would stop trying to prove I was right. I would become the person they wanted me to be, the confused, fragile wife, while I looked for the cracks in their story. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of burnt toast. I hadn't even gone to the kitchen yet. I walked downstairs and found Mark scraping a blackened slice of sourdough into the trash. "Again, Sarah?" he asked, his voice soft, devoid of anger but heavy with disappointment. "You really need to be more careful. You could have started a fire if I hadn't come down." I looked at the toaster. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been awake long enough to be hungry. I felt the familiar urge to defend myself, to shout that I had been upstairs the whole time, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I let my lip tremble. I let my shoulders slump. I don't remember coming down here, Mark. I'm so sorry." He sighed, walked over, and pulled me into a hug. It was a tight, suffocating embrace. Over his shoulder, I saw the toaster. It was plugged into a smart outlet, one that could be controlled by a phone. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He was doing it. He was physically manipulating the environment to create the illusion of my incompetence. The realization was both horrifying and liberating. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being gaslit with professional precision. As the day progressed, I noticed more small details. Elena called to check in on me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She mentioned a lunch date we supposedly had scheduled for that afternoon, one I had no record of in my calendar. "Oh, Sarah, honey, we talked about it on Tuesday. Don't you remember? We were going to discuss the gallery opening." I looked at my digital calendar. There was no entry, but when I checked again 5 minutes later, an entry appeared, synced from Mark's shared calendar. They were editing my digital life in real time. I felt a surge of nausea. How long had this been going on? How deep did the rabbit hole go? I went to my office and tried to log in to our primary investment account, the one that held the inheritance from my father's estate. Access denied. Incorrect password. I tried again, my fingers shaking. Denied. I had changed that password myself only a month ago. I tried to use the forgot password feature, but the recovery email had been changed to a primary account I didn't recognize. They were locking me out of my own life, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I spent the afternoon pretending to nap, but I was actually searching the room for anything they might have hidden. I looked behind the mirrors, inside the vents, under the bed frame. I found nothing until I checked the smoke detector in the corner of the ceiling. It looked slightly different from the others in the house. There was a tiny pinprick-sized hole in the casing that didn't belong there. I stood on a chair, my heart in my throat, and peered closer. A lens. A tiny high-definition camera lens was staring back at me. They weren't just gaslighting me, they were watching me. They wanted to see my reactions, to see if I was catching on, or perhaps to capture footage of my episodes to show to a judge or a doctor. I felt a wave of icy resolve wash over me. I stepped down from the chair, smoothed my hair, and looked directly into the hidden camera. I didn't glare, I didn't cry. I simply gave a small, vacant smile and walked out of the room. The game had truly begun, and for the first time in months, I felt like I had a chance to win. The rain continued to pour, turning the Pacific Northwest forest outside my windows into a wall of dark, weeping green. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the glass of water Mark had placed in front of me along with a small, white pill. He told me it was a mild sedative, something Dr. Eris had prescribed to help with my nocturnal agitation. I hadn't seen Dr. Eris yet, but apparently Mark had consulted him on my behalf. I looked at the pill, then up at Mark. He was smiling, that same tight, controlled smile that never reached his eyes. "It'll help you sleep, Sarah. You've been wandering the halls at night. It's for your own safety." I hadn't been wandering the halls. I had been lying perfectly still, paralyzed by the fear of what he was doing while I slept. I picked up the glass, took a sip, and tucked the pill into the side of my cheek, hidden behind my molars. I swallowed the water and gave him a faint, tired nod. "Thank you, Mark. I don't know what I'd do without you." He kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt like the brush of a spider's web, and led me upstairs. Once the door was closed and I was sure he had gone back downstairs to his office, I ran to the bathroom and spat the pill into a piece of tissue. It was slightly chalky, bitter. I didn't flush it. I needed to know what it was. I hid it inside a hollowed-out lipstick tube in the back of my vanity. This was my new reality, a series of small, desperate acts of preservation. I needed to get out of the house, but my car keys had been safely tucked away by Mark, and the security system was now armed with a code I no longer knew. I was a prisoner in a museum of my own life. I spent the next hour sitting on the edge of the bed, listening. I heard the low murmur of Mark's voice from downstairs. He was on the phone. I crept to the top of the stairs, staying in the shadows, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. "She took it," Mark was saying, his voice cold and clinical. "The doses are increasing. Eris says another week of this and she'll be incoherent enough for the involuntary hold. Elena, we have to be careful. She's starting to look at me differently." There was a pause as he listened to the other end. I know. The transfer is almost complete. Once she's in the facility, I'll have full power of attorney. We just need to keep the pressure on. Have you set up the incident for tomorrow?" My blood ran cold. An incident. They were planning something specific, something that would be the final nail in the coffin of my sanity. I retreated to the bedroom, my mind whirring. I needed an ally. I needed someone who wasn't part of their circle. But who was it? My parents were gone, and Elena had effectively isolated me from my other friends over the last year, whispering about my delicate state until they stopped calling. I was alone. The next morning, Elena arrived early. She brought coffee and a frantic energy that felt forced. "We're going to the gallery, Sarah. Just a quick visit to see the new installation. It'll do you good to get some fresh air." I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. If I resisted, it would be another symptom. If I went, I was walking into whatever trap they had set. I chose the trap. I dressed carefully, picking a bright red coat that felt like armor. As we drove, Elena chattered incessantly about nothing. Gossip, fashion, the weather. She was trying to keep me distracted. When we arrived at the gallery, the staff looked at me with a mixture of pity and awkwardness. I realized then how much groundwork they had already laid. They had been telling people I was sick for a long time. The incident happened near the large sculpture in the main hall. It was a delicate piece made of hand-blown glass, worth more than my car. Elena was standing next to me, pointing at something across the room, when I felt a sharp, forceful shove against my shoulder. I stumbled, my arms flailing, and crashed into the pedestal. The glass shattered with a sound like 1,000 screaming bells. I fell to the floor, my hands landing in the shards. "Sarah! Oh my God, what did you do?" Elena shrieked, her voice loud enough to draw every eye in the building. She didn't reach out to help me. She stood back, hands over her mouth, looking at the crowd that was beginning to gather. She just lost her balance. She's been having these dizzy spells." I looked up at her, blood dripping from a cut on my palm. She wasn't worried. She was triumphant. Mark arrived 20 minutes later, looking like the hero of a tragedy. He apologized to the gallery owner, offered to pay for the damage immediately, and practically carried me to the car. I remained silent, the shock of the physical pain in my hand acting as a grounding wire for my racing thoughts. "I told you weren't ready to go out," he whispered in the car, his grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. "You're a danger to yourself, and now you're becoming a liability." I didn't argue. I just looked out the window at the passing trees. I knew what was coming. The incident had been staged to provide witnesses. The staff at the gallery would testify that I was erratic, clumsy, and seemingly out of touch with reality. The medicine was likely a high-dose benzodiazepine or an antipsychotic that would make me appear sluggish and confused when the doctors finally arrived. I had to move faster. That night, while Mark was in the shower, I stole his phone. I knew the passcode. It was our wedding anniversary, a final insult to the life we had built. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I scrolled through his messages with Elena. It was worse than I thought. They had been planning this for over a year. There were photos of them together in our bed, in my office, laughing at the camera. There were spreadsheets detailing my assets, my father's trust fund, the life insurance policies. But then I found something they hadn't accounted for, a folder of deleted emails that Mark hadn't emptied. Among them was a message from a private investigator he had hired to look into me, looking for any history of mental illness in my family that they could use to bolster their case. The investigator's report was clear. There was no history. I was perfectly sane. Mark had replied to the report with a single line, "Then we'll have to create one." I heard the water click off in the bathroom. I quickly put the phone back on the nightstand and scrambled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. My hands were shaking so violently I had to sit on them to keep them still. I had the evidence, but I had no way to get it out. The phone was locked again, and if I took it, he would know immediately. I needed a way to record what I had seen. I needed a way to prove that I was the victim of a crime, not a patient in need of care. As I lay there, I remembered the hidden camera in the smoke detector. They were recording me, but that meant there was a server or a hard drive somewhere in the house where that footage was being stored. If I could find it, I could turn their own surveillance against them. I could show the world exactly how Mark and Elena had staged the episodes. I just had to survive long enough to find the source. The next few days were a blur of calculated performance. I took the medicine, spitting it out every time. I acted confused, and I let Mark lead me around the house like a child. I was waiting for the right moment to search for the surveillance hub. I knew it had to be in his office, the one room in the house that was always locked, the one room I was forbidden from entering because it was where he did his sensitive legal work. On Thursday, the opportunity finally presented itself. Mark had to go into the city for a meeting with our estate lawyers, no doubt to finalize the paperwork for my commitment. Elena was supposed to come over to watch me, but she called to say she was running late. I had a 40-minute window. I didn't waste time trying to pick the lock on the office door. I knew Mark kept a spare key hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the library, a classic, arrogant move for a man who thought he was the smartest person in any room. I found the key, unlocked the office, and stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive leather and Mark's cologne, a scent that now made my stomach turn. I went straight for his desk. It was meticulously organized, which worked to my advantage. I turned on his computer, praying he hadn't changed the password since the night I checked his phone. He hadn't. The desktop was clean, but I found a hidden partition on the hard drive labeled Project S. S for Sarah. Inside were hundreds of video files, organized by date. I clicked on one from last week. It showed me in the kitchen, staring at the boiling water. I watched as Mark, earlier that morning, had entered the kitchen while I was in the shower, turned on the stove, and then slipped out. The footage was damning. Another video showed him moving my keys into the refrigerator while I was looking for them in the hallway. I felt a surge of cold fury. It was all there, every lie, every manipulation, recorded in high definition. But I needed more than just these clips. I needed to see what they were planning next. I found a folder titled Final Phase. Inside was a PDF document and commitment order already signed by a Dr. Aris, pending a final evaluation that was scheduled for tomorrow morning at our house. They weren't waiting another week. They were moving the timeline up. I also found the financial records. Mark hadn't just been managing our accounts, he had been draining them. He had funneled nearly $2 million into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, held in both his and Elena's names. They weren't just going to put me away, they were going to disappear with everything I had. I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart stopped. It was too early for Mark, and Elena shouldn't have been here yet. I scrambled to close the folders and log out of the computer. I barely managed to lock the office door and hide the key back in the library before the front door opened. It was Elena. She looked flushed, her eyes darting around the room. "Sarah, where are you, honey?" I walked into the hallway, rubbing my eyes as if I had just woken up. "I'm here, Elena. I think I fell asleep on the sofa." She looked suspiciously, her gaze lingering on the office door for a second too long. "Mark said you were acting strange this morning. Are you feeling okay? You look a bit pale." She walked over and touched my forehead, her fingers cold and spindly. I fought the urge to flinch. "I'm just tired. I'm so tired of feeling like this." I let a few tears escape, a genuine expression of the exhaustion I felt, though not for the reasons she thought. She hugged me, and for the first time I felt the sharp edges of her betrayal. She had been my sister in everything but blood, and she was helping a man destroy me for a paycheck in a shared bed. "It'll be over soon, Sarah," she whispered into my ear. "Tomorrow, everything is going to change. You're going to get the help you need, and you won't have to worry about anything anymore." The malice in her voice was barely veiled by the soft tone. I realized then that they didn't just want my money, they wanted to erase me. They wanted to see the light go out of my eyes, to see me broken and compliant in a padded cell. I nodded against her shoulder, playing the part of the defeated woman. "I hope so, Elena. I really hope so." As she pulled away, I noticed a small black device in her hand, a digital recorder. She was recording our conversation. I had to be careful. Every word I said could be used against me in the morning. I spent the rest of the evening being docile. When Mark came home, he was in a celebratory mood, though he tried to hide it under a mask of somber concern. He brought home a bottle of expensive wine, claiming we should have a quiet night before the doctor arrived. I knew the wine was likely spiked. I watched him pour the glasses, his back to me. I saw him reach into his pocket and drop a small amount of clear liquid into my glass. My hands clenched into fists under the table. He was going to drug me tonight, to ensure I was completely out of it when Dr. Eris arrived. I waited until he was distracted by a phone call in the other room, and I quickly swapped our glasses. It was a risky move, but I had to know if he would notice. When he came back, he picked up the glass, the one he thought was mine, and raised it in a toast. To your health, Sarah, to a new beginning. He took a long, deep swallow. I did the same with the untainted wine. We sat in silence for a while, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. 10 minutes later, Mark's speech started to slur. His eyes became heavy, and he leaned back against the chair, looking confused. I feel a bit lightheaded, he muttered, shaking his head. I think the stress is getting to me. I watched him, my face a mask of concern. Maybe you should lie down, Mark. You've been doing so much for me lately. He nodded, stumbling as he tried to stand. I helped him to the sofa, watching as he drifted into a deep, drug-induced sleep. I didn't waste a second. I went back to his office. I knew I couldn't just copy the files. I needed to send them somewhere safe. I used his computer to upload the entire Project S folder to a cloud storage account I had secretly created at the gallery weeks ago. I also sent the financial records and the PDF of the commitment order to my lawyer, a man Mark thought I had fired months ago, but whom I had actually kept on a secret retainer. Then I did something I hadn't planned on. I took Mark's phone and recorded a video of him passed out on the sofa, with the spiked wine glass nearby. I held up the lipstick tube with the stolen pills to the camera. My name is Sarah, and I am not crazy. I knew tomorrow would be the final showdown. I had the evidence, but I was still trapped in the house with two people who would do anything to stop me from leaving. The morning of the evaluation arrived with a chilling gray stillness. Mark woke up late, groggy and visibly agitated. He didn't seem to remember the wine, or the fact that he had passed out, but he was on edge, his movements jerky and aggressive. I must have been more exhausted than I thought, he muttered, rubbing his temples as he paced the kitchen. I stayed quiet, nursing a cup of tea, playing the role of the fragile, fearful wife to perfection. Elena arrived at 9 a.m., looking polished and predatory in a sharp blazer. She kept checking her watch, her eyes flicking to the front door every few minutes. The stage was set. At 10 a.m., a sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. Dr. Eris had arrived. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a clinical, detached air that immediately made me feel like an insect under a microscope. Mark and Elena greeted him like an old friend. They led him into the living room where I was seated on the armchair, a blanket draped over my legs, despite the warmth of the house. I looked small, broken, and utterly defeated. Mark began the narrative immediately, his voice a low, mournful drone as he detailed my episodes, the accident at the gallery, and my increasingly violent outbursts. I didn't interrupt. I just stared at my lap, occasionally letting out a small, tremulous sigh. "And you, Sarah?" Dr. Eris asked, leaning forward, his pen poised over a notepad. "How do you feel about these lapses in memory? Mark tells me you've been wandering the house at night, speaking to people who aren't there." I looked up, my eyes wide and watery. I don't know, Doctor. Everything feels so foggy. Mark says I'm sick. Elena says I'm sick. If they both say it, it must be true, right? I saw Mark and Elena share a quick, satisfied glance. They thought they had me. They thought I'd finally broken under the weight of their lies. Dr. Eris nodded, scribbling something down. "It's common for patients in your condition to experience a sense of depersonalization. The world feels unreal because your brain is struggling to process information correctly." "Is it?" I asked, my voice suddenly clear and steady. The change in my tone was so abrupt that all three of them froze. I stood up, dropping the blanket to the floor. "Or is it unreal because my husband has been drugging my wine and my best friend has been editing my digital calendar to make me think I'm losing my mind?" Mark's face went pale, then instantly flushed with anger. "Sarah, honey, you're having another episode. Please, sit down. Doctor, you see, this is what I was talking about. The paranoia, the sudden shifts in mood." He moved toward me, his hands outstretched in a patronizing gesture of comfort. "Don't touch me, Mark," I said, stepping back. I pulled a small remote from my pocket, the one I had found in his office that controlled the smart displays in the living room. "I think Dr. Eris should see what I've been imagining." I pressed a button and the large television on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't the morning news. It was the footage from the hidden camera in the kitchen. There was Mark, clear as day, turning on the stove and then sneaking out of the room. I hit the next button. There was Elena, laughing as she moved my car keys into the refrigerator. The room went deathly silent, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Elena was the first to find her voice. This is a deep fake. Doctor, she's a digital artist. She could have easily fabricated this to discredit us." Her voice was shrill, borderline hysterical. Mark was staring at the screen, his jaw working as he tried to formulate a lie. Dr. Eris looked from the screen to Mark, his professional mask finally cracking. Mark, what is the meaning of this? I didn't wait for him to answer. I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of their conversation from the night before, the one I had captured from the hallway. Mark's voice filled the room, cold and calculating, discussing the involuntary hold and the transfer of assets. The shift in the room was palpable. The predators were suddenly the prey. Mark turned on me, his eyes filled with a terrifying cold light. You think you're so smart, don't you? You think a few videos are going to stop this? I have the power of attorney, Sarah. I have the medical records. You're still the one who smashed that sculpture. You're still the one who can't keep her story straight. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. No one is going to believe a woman who's been on antipsychotics for a month. I smiled at him, a genuine, sharp smile. Actually, Mark, I haven't taken a single pill. I've been keeping them, along with the wine you spiked last night. I sent them to a private lab this morning. The results should be in my lawyer's inbox by now. Dr. Aris stood up, his face ashen. I think I've seen enough. Mark, Elena, I suggest you find legal representation immediately. I will be contacting the authorities and retracting my evaluation. He turned to leave, but Mark grabbed his arm. You're not going anywhere, Aris. You're in this as deep as we are. You signed those papers without an examination. That's malpractice. You stay here and you finish what we started. The desperation in Mark's voice was unmistakable. He was cornered, and a cornered man is capable of anything. He looked at Elena, and I saw a silent agreement pass between them. They weren't going to let me walk out of this house. I backed away toward the front door, my hand on the handle. It's too late, Mark. I already sent everything to the police. They'll be here in minutes. It was a lie. I hadn't called the police yet. I had only sent the files to my lawyer, but I needed to create a diversion. Mark lunged for me, but I was faster. I bolted out the door and into the pouring rain, the cold water soaking through my clothes instantly. I ran toward the forest, the only place where the glass walls of my cage couldn't follow me. I could hear Mark shouting behind me, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. I didn't look back. I knew every inch of these woods, and I knew that in the dark, under the cover of the trees, I had the advantage. The woods were a labyrinth of shadows and slick, moss-covered earth. I could hear Mark crashing through the underbrush behind me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was screaming my name, a terrifying mixture of rage and feigned concern. Sarah, stop. You're making this worse. You're having a psychotic break. The gaslighting didn't stop, even now, when the truth was laid bare. I ducked behind a massive cedar tree, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was part of the forest now. Mark moved deeper into the woods, heading away from the house. I waited until his voice was a distant echo before I started to move. I stayed low, creeping through the ferns, my eyes fixed on the distant light of the house through the trees. I made it back to the edge of the lawn, my lungs burning, my hands raw from the branches. I saw Elena through the large glass windows of the living room. She was on the phone, panicking frantically, her face pale. She looked terrified. Good, she should be. I reached the side of the house where the security panel was located. I knew Mark had changed the code, but I also knew he was arrogant. He used the same 4 digits for everything. 0814, our anniversary. The panel beeped, and the small green light flickered on. The system was disarmed. I slipped inside through the mudroom, my movements silent. I needed my car keys, and I knew exactly where Mark had hidden them, in the safe in his office. I ran up the stairs, my wet shoes squeaking on the wood. I reached the office, unlocked the safe, again using our anniversary, and grabbed the keys. I also grabbed the backup hard drive Mark kept there, the one that likely held even more evidence of his financial crimes. As I turned to leave, I saw a shadow in the doorway. It was Elena. She was holding a heavy glass decanter from the bar downstairs. You're not leaving, Sarah, she whispered, her voice trembling. We worked too hard for this. I'm not going back to being a broke gallery assistant while you sit on millions you didn't even earn. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing but pity. You were my best friend, Elena. I would have given you anything if you had just asked. Why did you have to try and destroy me? She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Because you always had everything. The perfect family, the money, the house, the husband. I was just the sidekick. Mark was the only thing that was mine, and soon everything else will be mine too. She lunged at me, swinging the decanter with a desperate, clumsy force. I dodged her, the glass whistling past my head and shattering against the mahogany desk. We grappled, 2 women who had shared every secret now trying to tear each other apart. Elena was fueled by a decade of hidden resentment, but I was fueled by the raw, primal need to survive. I pushed her back, and she tripped over the office chair, falling hard against the floor. I didn't stay to see if she was hurt. I grabbed the hard drive and ran. I was halfway down the stairs when the front door burst open. Mark was back. He was drenched, his eyes blown wide with a frantic, manic energy. He saw me, and a low growl escaped his throat. Give me the drive, Sarah, he said, his voice dangerously calm. He was blocking the exit. Behind me, I heard Elena scrambling to her feet in the office. I was trapped. Mark started up the stairs, one slow step at a time. You don't want to do this. Just give me the drive and we can talk. We can work something out. You're not well, remember? Everyone knows you're not well. He was still trying to use the lie, even now. I looked at the drive in my hand, then at the man I had loved. I'm not the one who's not well, Mark. You're a monster, and everyone is about to find out. I looked past him, toward the front door. A set of headlights swerved into the driveway, the blue and red lights reflecting off the glass walls of the house. The police had arrived. My lawyer had called them after receiving the files. Mark froze, his head whipping around to look at the lights. In that moment of distraction, I didn't run past him, I ran toward him. I used my momentum to shove him with all my strength. He was off balance, his feet slick on the wet stairs. He tumbled backward, crashing down the flight of stairs, and landing in a heap at the bottom. Elena screamed from the top of the stairs, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I stood there, looking down at the man who had tried to steal my life, as the front door was kicked open and the room was filled with the harsh, cold light of authority. The aftermath was a whirlwind of sirens, statements, and the clinical coldness of the police station. Mark survived the fall, but he was arrested on the spot, along with Elena and Dr. Eris. The evidence I had gathered was more than enough to sink them. The Project S odor, the financial records, the laboratory results showing the presence of high-dose sedatives in my system. It was an open and shut case of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted kidnapping. As the sun began to rise over the gray Pacific Northwest horizon, I sat in the back of a police cruiser, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket, watching as they were led away in handcuffs. Mark looked pathetic, his arrogance stripped away, replaced by a hollow, fearful expression. Elena was sobbing, her cries echoing through the damp morning air. She tried to look at me one last time, but I turned my head away. She was a stranger now. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of their betrayal was revealed. Mark had been planning to sell the house and move to Europe with Elena as soon as I was safely tucked away in the facility Dr. Eris managed. They had already spent thousands of my father's money on consulting fees and preliminary arrangements. The legal battle was long and grueling, but with the evidence I provided, I was able to reclaim every cent they had stolen. My lawyer, a man who had become my only true ally, worked tirelessly to ensure that Mark and Elena received the maximum sentence. They were both convicted of multiple felonies, and the perfect couple was separated by prison walls for the next decade. Dr. Eris lost his medical license and faced several years of his own behind bars. I stayed in the house for a while, but the glass walls no longer felt like a cage. They felt like a reminder of a life that was gone. I eventually sold it and moved to a small, quiet cottage near the coast, far away from the shadows of the forest. The gaslighting had left its marks, of course. For a long time, I couldn't trust a clock that I hadn't set myself, and I checked every smoke detector in every room I entered. But slowly, the fog began to lift. I started painting again. My work no longer focused on the fragility Elena had always praised, but on the strength of the things that survived the storm. I realized that they hadn't just tried to steal my money, they had tried to steal my sense of self, and in fighting back, I had found a version of myself that was stronger than I ever imagined. One afternoon, a year later, I received a letter from Mark. It was a rambling, desperate plea for forgiveness, filled with the same old manipulations and excuses. He claimed he had only done it because he was scared of losing me, and that Elena had pressured him. I didn't even finish reading it. I took the letter to the fireplace and watched as the flames consumed his words, turning his lies into ash. I realized then that the greatest revenge wasn't just seeing them in prison, it was living a life where they no longer mattered. I looked out at the ocean, the waves crashing against the shore with a rhythmic, powerful certainty. I was Sarah, I was sane, and I was finally, truly free.